When hatred becomes an echo and magic demands submission, enemies have no choice but to yield. A story of light and darkness, weaving a thread that could save the world or burn their hearts. The air in the antechamber was cool, smelling faintly of old stone and the damp, earthy scent of the dungeons that seemed to cling to the castle's foundations even in the height of spring. Hermione Granger stood before a tall, silver-framed mirror, her reflection fragmented by the age of the glass. But the determination in her eyes was whole, unbroken. She smoothed the front of her dueling robes, midnight blue, trimmed with a sensible academic grey, and felt the familiar, frantic flutter of a pulse beneath her collarbone. It was ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. She was the professor of charms, a war heroine, the brightest witch of her age, and a woman who had faced down dark lords and dragons. Yet, here she was, her hands trembling ever so slightly because of a faculty tournament. No, that wasn't true. Her hands were trembling because of him. Through the thick oak door, the roar of the great hall was a muffled, rhythmic thrum, like the heartbeat of a giant beast. The students were out there, the staff was out there, and Draco Malfoy was out there. She closed her eyes, exhaling a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. For 5 years, they had circled each other in these corridors like two celestial bodies trapped in a decaying orbit. As the potions master, Malfoy was infuriatingly competent, sharp-tongued, and, much to her annoyance, beloved by his students for his dry, biting wit. They had moved from enemies to cold colleagues, and from cold colleagues to this, whatever this was. A series of heated debates in the staff room that lasted too long. Glances across the high table that felt like physical touches. A tension so thick it felt like ozone before a lightning strike. A sharp knock on the door shattered her thoughts. "Professor Granger," squeaked a small voice. It was a second-year Hufflepuff, wide-eyed and clutching a scroll. "Headmistress McGonagall says it's time. The other finalist is ready." Hermione offered the boy a tight, reassuring smile, though she felt anything but reassured. "Thank you. I'm coming." She gripped her wand, the vinewood warm and grounding against her palm, and pushed the door open. The noise hit her instantly, a wall of sound. The great hall had been transformed. The 4 house tables were pushed to the edges, creating a massive amphitheatre. Floating high above, the enchanted ceiling swirled with a playful representation of a stormy sky, flashing harmless purple lightning that drew oohs and ahs from the students. In the center of the room rose a long, gilded dueling platform, bathed in the soft, theatrical glow of 100 hovering candelabras. And there he was. Draco Malfoy stood at the far end of the platform, looking devastatingly bored. He was leaning against the railing, inspecting his fingernails as if he were waiting for a particularly slow-brewing cauldron to simmer. He wore black, of course, fitted dueling robes that hugged the broad line of his shoulders and tapered at the waist, devoid of any unnecessary ornamentation. The high collar framed the pale, aristocratic line of his jaw. As Hermione ascended the stairs to the platform, the crowd erupted. The Gryffindors were screaming her name, a chaotic chorus of support, while the Slytherins stomped their feet in a rhythmic, tribal beat for their head of house. Draco looked up. The moment their eyes met, the noise of the hall seemed to drop away, dampened as if they were underwater. He didn't smile. Malfoy rarely smiled with his mouth. He did it with his eyes, a narrowing of the lids that suggested he knew a secret about you that you hadn't even realized yourself. He straightened, pushing off the railing with a fluid, predatory grace, and turned to face her. "Granger," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the ambient noise, carried by the subtle amplification charms woven into the platform. It was a voice like velvet dragged over gravel, smooth, textured, and deeply affecting. "You actually showed up. I had a galleon on you fleeing to the library to research advanced shielding for the hopelessly outmatched." Hermione stepped onto the mat, chin lifted. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from the thrill of the engagement. This was their dance. This was the only way they knew how to speak to each other without ruining everything. "And miss the opportunity to fix that posture of yours, Malfoy," she shot back, her tone light, teasing, but laced with a competitive edge. "I noticed you were lagging in the semi-finals against Professor Longbottom. A bit sluggish in the wand arm, too much time stirring cauldrons, not enough time practicing real magic." A ripple of laughter went through the students. Draco's mouth twitched at the corner. He walked slowly toward the center of the platform, and she mirrored him, drawn in like a moth to a flame. "Neville got lucky," Draco drawled, stopping a few paces from the center line. He looked her up and down, a gaze that felt tangible, brushing against her robes. It wasn't lewd, it was analytical, intense. He was cataloguing her. "And as for real magic, Granger, try not to burn the castle down with your over-enthusiasm. We just had the tapestries repaired." "I promise to leave the castle standing," Hermione said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming softer, more intimate despite the hundreds of people watching. "I can't promise the same for your ego." They were close now. Too close for a duel, really. The referee, Madame Hooch, had to step in between them, her yellow hawk-like eyes darting between the two professors. "Back to your positions," Hooch barked, though there was a twinkle of amusement in her gaze. "This is a standard duel. Disarming or incapacitation wins the match. No unforgivables, obviously. Professor Malfoy, stop smirking. And no transfiguration of the opponent into a ferret. We've had enough of that for one lifetime." Draco let out a short, surprised laugh, a sound that made Hermione's stomach do a traitorous flip. He bowed to Hooch, then turned his grey eyes back to Hermione. He bowed. It was a pure-blood gesture, elegant and archaic, a sweep of the arm and a dip of the torso that spoke of centuries of tradition. But as he rose, his eyes locked onto hers with a searing intensity. In that split second, the mask slipped. She saw the exhaustion behind the grey, the hunger for something he wouldn't name, the silent question that had been hanging between them for months. "Are you seeing me? Really seeing me?" Hermione returned the bow, her movements sharper, more precise. She felt the magic gathering in her blood, a hum of energy that responded to his presence. It was always like this when they were close. Her magic felt alert. "Scared, Granger?" he whispered, low enough that only she could hear it over the roar of the crowd. "Terrified you'll trip over your own robes, Malfoy," she whispered back, gripping her wand tighter. They backed away to their respective ends of the platform. The distance felt wrong. It felt like stretching a rubber band until it was ready to snap. Hooch raised her hand. Wands at the ready. Hermione assumed her stance. Feet shoulder-width apart, knees slightly bent, wand arm extended. She focused on her breathing. In, out. She needed to be fast. Draco was a duelist of the old school. Economical, fast, and deceptive. He didn't waste movement. She relied on power and creativity. "On the count of 3, Hooch yelled. 1. Hermione's eyes flicked to Draco's hand. Long fingers, pale skin, the black hawthorn wand held loosely, deceptively relaxed. 2. The atmosphere in the hall shifted. The playful cheering died down into a hushed, vibrating anticipation. The air between them shimmered, literally bending with the weight of 2 powerful magical cores flaring to life. It felt like the drop in pressure before a thunderstorm. Hermione watched a bead of sweat track down the side of Draco's temple. She saw the minute tightening of his jaw. He was beautiful in this light, sharp and dangerous and utterly captivating. She hated how much she wanted to cross the distance and touch him, and she loved that she was about to hex him instead. It was a confusing, intoxicating cocktail of emotions. 3. Duel! The world exploded into motion and light. Draco moved first, a blur of black robes. Rictus Sempra! The silver jet of light shot across the platform. Hermione didn't dodge. She deflected. With a sharp flick of her wrist, she cast a silent protego, catching the spell on a shimmering shield of blue energy. But she didn't just block it. She angled her shield, ricocheting his own spell into the floor at his feet, sending up a spray of golden sparks. "Sloppy!" she called out, laughing despite herself. The adrenaline hit her system like sparkling wine. She spun, her robes flaring. Aquamenti! A powerful jet of water erupted from her wand, not to drown, but to slip him up. Draco vanished. Or rather, he moved with such speed it looked like an apparition. He slid to the left, the water splashing harmlessly against the barrier behind him. He was grinning now, a genuine, boyish grin that took years off his face. "Is that a bath, Granger? I showered this morning," he shouted across the platform. He countered with a gust of wind, a localized hurricane designed to knock her off balance. Hermione planted her feet, muttering a stabilizing charm, her hair whipping furiously around her face. She felt wild, untethered. This wasn't just a duel, it was a conversation, a dialogue of energy and intent. "I am here," his magic said with every strike. "I am your equal," her magic replied with every block. She fired a stinging hex, aiming for his arm. He parried it with a lazy flick, sending it spiraling into the ceiling, where it exploded into a shower of harmless purple rain. "Densaugeo," he cast, his eyes dancing with mischief. "Really? 4th year?" Hermione gasped, dodging the beam of light. "Antioculatia." "Antlers? You want to give me antlers?" Draco laughed, ducking under the red bolt of light. They were dancing. They were circling each other, trading spells that were becoming less about incapacitation and more about showing off. The crowd was roaring, but Hermione barely heard them. All she could see was him. All she could feel was the strange magnetic pull that seemed to tug at her navel every time their spells clashed. But as the duel wore on, the air began to feel thick, heavy. Hermione cast a stunning spell, putting a little more power behind it this time. "Stupefy!" Draco raised his wand to block, his lips forming the countercurse. But as her red light met his invisible shield, something happened. There was no crash, no bang. Instead, there was a sound like a great resonant bell tolling deep underwater. The red light didn't bounce off. It seemed to sink into his shield. Draco's eyes widened. He looked at his wand, then at her. The air between them shimmered with a strange pearlescent haze. "Granger," he said, and for the first time there was no mockery in his voice, only confusion. I don't know," she stammered, lowering her wand slightly. The crowd didn't seem to notice yet. They were cheering for the light show, but Hermione felt it, a vibration in the floorboards, a warmth spreading up her arm from her wand, like holding a cup of hot tea on a winter morning. It wasn't hostile. It was welcoming. She looked at Draco across the shimmering distance. The playful hostility was melting away, replaced by a sudden, terrifying awareness of the man beneath the robes. The way his chest heaved with exertion, the way his hair had fallen into his eyes. The way he was looking at her, not as an opponent, but as if she were a puzzle he was desperate to solve. And the magic, her magic, was reaching out to him, not to fight, but to touch. The duel had only just begun, but the battle lines were already blurring. And in the center of the great hall, under the gaze of hundreds, Hermione Granger realized with a jolt of panic that the most dangerous thing on this platform wasn't Draco Malfoy's wand. It was the sudden, overwhelming desire to find out what would happen if she stopped fighting him and let that strange, warm resonance pull them together. The resonance of the bell-like tolling faded, but the vibration remained, humming in the marrow of Hermione's bones. It was a sensation akin to touching a portkey seconds before activation, a hook behind the navel, a promise of displacement. She stared at Draco, her wand hand trembling not from fear, but from a bizarre excess of energy that seemed to be bubbling up from the floorboards. Draco lowered his wand by a fraction of an inch, his brow furrowed in that specific way that meant he was recalculating variables. The grey of his eyes had darkened, reflecting the storm cloud ceiling above, but there was a flicker of something else there, uncertainty. "Did you just absorb my spell, Granger?" he called out, his voice carrying a jagged edge of incredulity. "That was a stunner. You're supposed to fall over, not glow." Hermione looked down at herself. He was right. A faint, ethereal luminescence was clinging to the fabric of her robes, soft as moonlight. She brushed at it, but the light didn't disperse. It clung to her fingers, warm and tingling. "I didn't absorb anything," she retorted, though her voice lacked its usual authoritative cadence. She felt flushed, her skin prickly with static. "Your aim is off. You probably hit the warding charms." "My aim," Draco sneered, recovering his composure with practiced ease, "is impeccable. Let's try again, shall we? Try not to break the laws of physics this time." He slashed his wand through the air, a movement so sharp it whistled. "Expelliarmus!" The scarlet jet of light left his wand with the force of a cannon blast. Hermione gasped, instinctively throwing up a protego. She braced herself for the impact, digging her heels into the dueling platform. But the impact never came. As the disarming charm collided with her shield, the air between them warped. The scarlet light didn't shatter the blue barrier. Instead, it seemed to unravel upon contact. The aggressive energy of the spell dissolved, swirling momentarily like red ink in water, before bursting outward in a spectacular, silent explosion. It wasn't fire. It wasn't force. It was confetti. Thousands of shimmering, heart-shaped pieces of paper rained down between them, fluttering lazily in the magically stilled air. They were pink and silver, catching the candlelight as they fell, drifting onto the platform, onto Hermione's hair, onto Draco's stunned shoulders. The great hall fell silent for a heartbeat, and then a ripple of titters broke out from the student sections. Draco stood frozen, his wand still extended, a piece of pink confetti landing squarely on the bridge of his nose. He went cross-eyed looking at it, then blew it off with a sharp exhale of indignity. "Confetti," he said flatly. "I cast a disarming charm, and you turned it into a parade." "I didn't do it," Hermione shrilled, her logical mind frantically flipping through textbooks, searching for a counter-theory. Gamp's law of elemental transfiguration, wand core interference, atmospheric pressure. "It's the atmospheric charms. The ceiling must be malfunctioning." "The ceiling is fine, Granger. It's us," Draco snapped, though he didn't sound angry anymore. He sounded panicked. He took a step forward, crushing the paper hearts under his dragon-high boots. "Everter statum." He cast again, desperate to re-establish the normalcy of combat. The spell flew towards her, a spiral of orange light intended to knock her backward. Hermione didn't even have time to shield. She just threw her hand out, wandless, instinctively pushing the magic away. The orange spiral hit the invisible wall of her will and instantly transformed. It didn't dissipate. It blossomed. The spell transmuted mid-air into a flock of canary-yellow canaries that erupted with a joyous chirping sound. They fluttered around Draco's head, tweeting a melody that sounded suspiciously like a waltz. The laughter in the hall grew louder. Someone at the Hufflepuff table was applauding. Draco swatted at a bird that was trying to nest in his platinum hair. "Get off! Finite! Finite incantatum!" The birds ignored him. One landed on the tip of his wand, trilling happily. Hermione watched, her mouth slightly open. The situation was spiraling into absurdity, but beneath the embarrassment, she felt that pull again. Stronger this time. Every time their magic interacted, the distance between them felt less like empty space and more like a bridge being built. The air was getting warmer, smelling of ozone, parchment, and something distinctly masculine, cedar and expensive soap. It was the scent of him, amplified 1,000 times. "Stop laughing!" Draco roared at the crowd, his face flushing a pale pink that Hermione found, against her will, devastatingly charming. He looked at her, his eyes wild. "Granger, do something! Throw a hex! Something nasty! I need to know my wand still works!" "Right. Yes. Nasty hex," Hermione muttered. She gripped her vinewood wand. She needed to focus. Cold, hard logic. Pure academic intent. She aimed at his chest. "Furnunculus!" The boil-causing hex shot towards him. Draco didn't move. He seemed resigned to taking the hit just to prove a point. But the curse never landed. A few feet from his chest, the sickly yellow light turned a brilliant, sparkling gold. It wrapped around him like a ribbon, swirling softly before dissipating into a shower of bubbles. Big, iridescent, soapy bubbles. They floated around him, popping softly against his robes. One drifted past his cheek, and he looked at it with a mixture of horror and fascination. "Bubbles," Draco whispered, his voice cracking. "You tried to give me boils, and you gave me a bubble bath." The tension in the room shifted. It wasn't a duel anymore. It was a performance, and the magic was the conductor. The audience was roaring with laughter now, The professors at the high table were standing up, peering over the edge. Flitwick looked delighted. Snape's portrait in the headmistress's office was likely scowling so hard the oil paint would crack. But for Hermione, the laughter was background noise. Her focus was entirely on the sensation pulsing through her wand arm. It was a rhythmic thrumming, syncing perfectly with the beating of her heart. Thump, 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 thump. She looked at Draco. He was staring at his hand, then at her. He felt it too. The realization dawned in his eyes, sweeping away the embarrassment and replacing it with a sharp, terrified clarity. "The wards," he said, his voice dropping to a hush that carried to her on the strange, thick air. "Granger, look at the wards." Hermione tore her gaze from him and looked at the translucent barrier surrounding the dueling platform. Usually, the Protego Horribilis used for tournaments was a shimmering, colourless heat haze. Now it was pulsing. It was throbbing in deep, violet waves, matching the rhythm in her blood. The barrier was no longer separating them from the crowd. It was sealing them in together. The sounds of the students, the laughter, the cheering, began to muffle, sounding distant and warped as if they were underwater. The world outside the platform was blurring, losing focus, leaving only the two of them in sharp, hyper-real definition. "They're sinking," Hermione breathed, the words tasting like copper on her tongue. "The barrier isn't reacting to the spells. It's reacting to the interaction between our cores." "It's isolating us," Draco murmured. He took a step toward her. The canaries vanished, the confetti dissolved, the bubbles popped, the air cleared, but the pressure increased tenfold. It was heavy, electric, charging the fine hairs on her arms. "Don't come closer," Hermione warned, though her feet betrayed her, shifting slightly toward him. "We don't know what." "I can't help it," he confessed, and the vulnerability in his tone struck her harder than any hex. "It's pulling." He was right. It was a physical force now, like gravity tilting the platform. The magic wanted them close. It demanded proximity. Draco raised his wand again, but this time there was no aggression in his stance. He looked like a man trying to solve a riddle that might kill him. "One more try," he said softly. "To break the resonance, we have to overload it. Maximum power. On 3. Hermione nodded, swallowing hard. She understood the theory. If the magical connection was a stream, they needed to create a dam loud enough to burst it. On 3. 1. His eyes were silver fire. 2. Her breath hitched. 3. Stupefy. Stupefy! They yelled the incantation simultaneously. The red jets of light left their wands at the exact same microsecond. They met in the dead center of the platform. There was no explosion, no shower of sparks, no confetti. Instead, the two beams of light fused. They twisted around each other, braiding themselves into a thick, radiant rope of pure white energy. The connection solidified, linking the tip of Hermione's wand to the tip of Draco's. The shock wave hit them both, not as a blow, but as a rush of sensation. Hermione gasped as a flood of images that weren't hers assaulted her mind. The smell of green apples, the biting cold of the manor, the crushing weight of expectations, the fear, the loneliness, the way the light caught in her hair during third-year potions. Across the platform, Draco stumbled back, his eyes blowing wide. He was seeing it too. The smell of old books, the warmth of the Gryffindor common room, the desperate need to prove herself, the scar on her arm, the way his voice sounded in her dreams. The bond of light between them pulsed, growing brighter, blindingly intense. It wasn't fighting them, it was celebrating them. The violet wards around the arena flared, shooting pillars of light up toward the enchanted ceiling, turning the storm clouds into a calm, starry night. Above the platform, the giant, magical scoreboard, which had been confusedly flickering between points, suddenly let out a loud, mechanical whirring noise. The numbers spun rapidly, blurring into a grey streak. Score 10 to 10. Score 50 to 50 score. Error. With a final, cheerful ding, the numbers vanished entirely. In their place, large, glittering golden letters began to scroll across the board, visible to the entire school. Synchronization. Metric. Off the charts. Status. Critical compatibility. The beam of light connecting their wands began to shorten, physically dragging them toward the center. Hermione planted her feet, but the floor seemed to slide beneath her. Draco groaned, gripping his wand with both hands, trying to pull back, but he was sliding too. They were being reeled in. "Granger!" he gritted out, his voice strained with the effort of resisting the inevitable. "If we collide, I'm blaming you." "Blaming me?" she cried, fighting the magnetic pull with every ounce of her strength. "You're the one who cast the first spell." "I was trying to duel you, not soul bond with you in front of the entire student body." They were 10 feet apart. The light was so bright now that Hermione could barely see the hall. She could only see him. The sweat on his brow, the panic in his eyes, and the terrifying, undeniable realization that her magic didn't want to fight him. It wanted to know him. It recognized him as something necessary, a missing half, 5 feet. The heat was intense, a tropical warmth that flushed her skin. The air crackled with the sound of 1,000 tiny sparks. "Draco!" she shouted, using his given name without thinking. "Hermione!" he yelled back, the sound of her name on his lips sending a shiver through her that had nothing to do with magic. They slammed together in the center of the platform. They didn't crash. They didn't fall. As their chests touched, the blinding white light imploded, vanishing in an instant. The violet wards dropped. The noise of the great hall rushed back in like a tidal wave, a deafening roar of confusion, laughter, and shock. But in the center of the platform, surrounded by the fading echoes of their spell, Draco Malfoy and Hermione Granger stood frozen. His hand was gripping her upper arm to steady her. Her hand was clutching the lapel of his robes. They were breathing heavily, their faces inches apart, their wands still humming against each other's sides. The silence between them was louder than the screaming crowd. Draco stared down at her, his pupils blown wide, his chest rising and falling against hers. He didn't let go. He didn't step back. For a long, suspended second, he just looked at her, and the mask was completely gone. There was no arrogance left, only a raw, bewildered wonder. "Well," he whispered, his voice shaking slightly, the sound intimate enough to brush against her lips. "That wasn't a standard duel." Hermione stared up at him, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She could smell him, cedar, spice, and the sharp tang of ozone. She could feel the heat radiating from his body. And God help her, she didn't want to move. "No," she breathed, her voice barely audible. "I don't think it was." And then, from the high table, the magically amplified voice of Headmistress McGonagall cut through the haze, sounding entirely too smug. Match suspended. Both participants to my office. Immediately. The heavy oak doors of the great hall groaned shut behind them, severing the connection to the roar of the student body. The silence of the corridor was instant and jarring, heavy with the dust of centuries and the faint, rhythmic dripping of a distant, leaky pipe. Hermione walked fast. It was her default reaction to panic, movement. If she moved fast enough, perhaps she could outpace the reality of what had just happened. Her heels clicked sharply against the flagstones, a staccato rhythm that echoed too loudly in the emptiness. Draco kept pace easily, his long strides eating up the distance without effort, though the usual fluid grace of his walk was marred by a rigid tension in his shoulders. "Slow down, Granger," he snapped, his voice rougher than usual. "You're walking as if the Dark Lord himself has resurrected to critique your spellwork." "I am walking," Hermione hissed, not turning her head. "With purpose. We have been summoned. I intend to arrive before the headmistress decides to transfigure us into pocket watches." "She wouldn't dare," Draco muttered, though he sounded unconvinced. "I'm expensive." They reached the grand staircase, and Hermione was forced to stop as the marble flight shifted, grinding slowly away from the third-floor landing. The pause was excruciating. Without the distraction of movement, the sensory details of the last 10 minutes crashed over her. She could still feel the phantom pressure of his chest against hers. The heat. It wasn't just physical warmth. It was a magical residue, a tingling static that clung to her skin like a second layer of clothing. Her magic felt stretched. Like a muscle that had been pulled too hard, it throbbed with a dull, persistent ache that seemed to reach out toward the man standing 2 feet away from her. She risked a glance at him. Draco was staring straight ahead at a portrait of a sleeping knight, his jaw set so hard a muscle feathered beneath the pale skin. He looked impeccable, infuriatingly so, but there were cracks in the armor. His hands, usually still, were flexing at his sides, fingers twitching as if grasping for a wand he'd already holstered. A faint flush still stained the high arch of his cheekbones, a rare splash of color on a canvas of winter grey. He felt her looking. He always felt her looking. He turned his head slowly, and for a moment they were just 2 people trapped on a moving staircase, suspended over a darkened abyss. The air between them thickened, charged with that same terrified electricity that had sparked on the dueling platform. "What did you do?" he asked quietly. It wasn't an accusation, not really. It sounded more like a plea for logic in a world that had suddenly gone mad. "I didn't do anything," Hermione defended herself, clutching her robes tighter around her. "You felt it, Malfoy. The wards, they changed. It was a feedback loop, a magical anomaly caused by the proximity of 2 incompatible cores clashing in a confined space." "Incompatible?" Draco let out a short, dry laugh that lacked any humor. He stepped closer, crowding her space, and Hermione's breath hitched. He smelled of cooling ash and the crisp scent of snow. "Is that what you call that? Incompatibility? Granger, my wand is still vibrating. It's been 5 minutes, and the hawthorn is humming like a bloody beehive because it thinks your vinewood is its long-lost twin." "It's a resonance echo," she argued, desperate to categorize the phenomenon, to label it and file it away. "It happens. Rarely. It's textbook theory." Burn the textbooks, he cut in, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. He leaned down, his grey eyes searching hers, frantic and piercing. I have dueled dark wizards. I have cast unforgivables. I have never, in my life, had my magic simply refused to fight. It didn't just stop, Granger. It surrendered to you. The vulnerability of the admission hung between them, stark and terrifying. Draco Malfoy did not surrender. He survived. He evaded. He struck, but he did not yield. Before Hermione could find the words, before she could admit that her magic hadn't just surrendered, but had welcomed him home, the staircase shuddered into place with a definitive thud. Professor McGonagall is waiting, Hermione whispered, breaking the spell. She turned and fled up the stairs, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Draco didn't follow immediately. He stood there for a second, watching her retreat, his hand brushing absently over the lapel of his robe where she had grabbed him. He closed his eyes, exhaling a shaky breath before composing his face into a mask of bored indifference and following her up. The gargoyle guarding the headmistress's office leaped aside before Hermione could even utter the password. The spiraling stone stairs carried them up in silence, depositing them into the circular room that had been the seat of Hogwarts' power for centuries. It was exactly as Dumbledore had left it, though with distinctly Scottish touches. Tartan throws draped over the armchairs, a tin of ginger newts on the desk, and a fire that crackled with a comforting domestic warmth. Headmistress McGonagall sat behind the massive claw-footed desk. She wasn't writing. She wasn't reading. She was simply sitting, her hands clasped in front of her, watching the door with the expression of a cat who has just pushed a very expensive vase off a shelf and is waiting to see what the humans will do about it. Hermione stopped in front of the desk, smoothing her hair. Draco flanked her, slouching slightly in a posture of practiced nonchalance. "Headmistress," Hermione began, breathless. "I want to apologize for the disruption. The dueling platform, there was clearly a malfunction with the localized atmospheric charms. I suspect the humidity from the lake interfered with the ionization of the shielding spells, causing a—" "Sit down, Hermione," McGonagall said. Her voice was calm, amused, and brooked no argument. Hermione's mouth snapped shut. She sat. Draco took the chair beside her, crossing one leg over the other and inspecting the lint on his trousers. "Professor Malfoy," McGonagall acknowledged with a slight nod. "You look remarkably unruffled for a man who just generated enough magical synergy to short-circuit the castle's scoring system." "I aim to please Minerva," Draco drawled, though his eyes remained wary. "Though I'd appreciate it if next time you test new wards, you don't use us as guinea pigs. My hair still smells like bubblegum." "The wards were not new, Draco," McGonagall said softly. She reached into a drawer and pulled out a long, shimmering roll of parchment. She placed it on the desk between them. It was glowing faintly. "These," she said, tapping the parchment with a manicured nail, "are the readouts from the synergy wards I had installed last week. They are designed to measure magical compatibility for the purpose of mentorship pairings among the students. I thought the faculty tournament would be a spirited way to calibrate them." Hermione leaned forward, her eyes scanning the complex arithmancy equations scrolling across the paper. Her breath caught. "These numbers," This isn't right. The coefficient of synchronization is impossible. It's above 98%. 99.4% to be precise, McGonagall corrected, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. I haven't seen a reading like this since, well, since the Founders, if the legends are to be believed. Draco uncrossed his legs, the boredom vanishing. He leaned forward, staring at the parchment with a frown. What are you saying? That Granger and I are… what? Compatible? Complementary, McGonagall corrected. Your magical cores are polar opposites in origin. Chaos and order, dark and light, instinct and logic. But they are identical in frequency. Nature abhors a vacuum, Draco. When you two stop fighting, the universe tries to fuse you together to create balance. Silence stretched in the room, thick and heavy. That's absurd, Draco spat, sitting back. I can't stand her. And I find him insufferable, Hermione added quickly, perhaps too quickly. And yet, McGonagall said, her eyes twinkling behind her square spectacles, magic does not lie. Which brings me to the reason you are here. This wasn't just a tournament, it was an audition. She waved her wand, and a heavy wooden box floated from the top of a cabinet to land with an ominous thud on the desk. It was wrapped in chains, etched with runes that Hermione recognized instantly as high-level containment wards. The Ministry recovered this artifact 3 months ago from a vault in Albania, McGonagall explained, her tone shifting from amused to grave. It is called the Ethereal Weaver. It is, essentially, a magical loom capable of repairing the structural damage done to the fabric of reality during the war. Hermione stared at the box. She had read about this. It was theoretical magic, dangerous and unstable. But the Weaver requires 2 operators, she whispered, her mind racing. 1 to hold the threads of reality, 1 to weave them. If the operators aren't perfectly synced, the backlash would liquefy their organs, turn them inside out, erase them from time. Draco supplied helpfully, looking pale. Something like that, McGonagall agreed. The Department of Mysteries has tried 4 different pairs of unspeakables. All of them ended up in St. Mungo's with severe magical exhaustion and temporary amnesia. The Weaver rejects anyone who isn't compatible. She let the word hang there. Hermione looked at the box, then at Draco. He was staring at the chains, his expression unreadable. She knew what he was thinking. He was thinking about redemption. He was thinking about how much he still owed the world for the mistakes of his youth. And he was thinking about the risk. You want us to do it, Hermione stated flatly. I don't want you to do it, McGonagall said, folding her hands. I am assigning you to do it. The Ministry has given Hogwarts custody of the artifact because I assured them I had the staff to handle it. You two are the only ones with the magical density to survive the initial connection, and as today proved, you are the only ones with the synchronization to manipulate it. And if we refuse, Draco asked, his voice low, then the artifact remains unstable, and the tears in the magical fabric continue to widen. We've already seen the leaks, wild magic surges, weather anomalies. It will get worse. McGonagall looked at him, her gaze softening. Draco, you have been looking for a way to use your talents for something constructive. This is it. Draco flinched slightly. He looked away, his jaw working. And you, Hermione. McGonagall turned to her. You have never backed down from a challenge. This isn't a challenge, Minerva. Hermione said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and indignation. This is intimacy. Forced magical intimacy. You saw what happened on that platform. We couldn't control it. If we open that box, we're not just weaving spells. We're opening our minds to each other. Then you had best start practicing, McGonagall said briskly, standing up to signal the end of the meeting. You will meet 3 evenings a week in the astronomy tower. It's the most magically neutral ground. You have 1 month to stabilize your connection before you attempt to open the Weaver. 1 month? Draco stood up, his chair scraping loudly. To undo 10 years of mutual animosity? You don't have to like each other, Professor Malfoy, McGonagall said, moving to the fireplace and picking up a pinch of Floo powder. She looked back at them, a knowing, almost mischievous glint in her eyes. You just have to trust each other. And judging by the way you are currently standing, I'd say you're closer than you think. Hermione looked down. Without realizing it, she had moved closer to Draco during the conversation. Their robes were brushing. Her arm was inches from his. And the humming in her veins, that warm, treacherous, golden song, was louder than ever. Draco stepped back as if burned. He looked at Hermione, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror and fascination. 1 month, he repeated, sounding defeated. Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday nights, McGonagall confirmed, tossing the powder into the fire. Emerald flames roared to life. Off you go, and do try not to turn the astronomy tower into a bubble bath. Filch is still cleaning up the Great Hall. They walked out in silence. The descent down the spiral stairs felt longer than the ascent. When they reached the corridor, they stopped. The castle was quiet now, the students in their dormitories. The torchlight flickered, casting long, dancing shadows against the stone walls. Draco turned to face her. He looked tired. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a weary resignation that made him look younger, more like the boy she had seen crying in the bathroom in 6th year than the man who commanded the dungeons. Granger, he said softly. Malfoy, she replied, wrapping her arms around herself. I'm not going to make this easy, he warned, though the bite was gone from his tone. I don't do partners, and I certainly don't do whatever this is. He gestured vaguely between them. Good, Hermione said, lifting her chin, trying to summon the Gryffindor courage that was currently hiding under a table in her mind. Because I don't have time for your neuroses, Malfoy. I have a curriculum to teach. Right, he said. He stared at her for a moment longer, his gaze dropping to her lips before snapping back up to her eyes. The tension flared again, hot and sudden, a physical pull that made Hermione's knees weak. Tuesday, then. Tuesday, she agreed. He nodded once, sharp and precise, and turned on his heel. His robes billowed behind him as he strode away into the darkness of the dungeons. Hermione watched him go until he was swallowed by the shadows. She stood alone in the corridor, listening to the fading echo of his footsteps, and brought a hand up to touch her chest. Her heart was beating so hard it hurt. And beneath the fear, beneath the annoyance, beneath the years of prejudice and history, she felt a terrifying, undeniable spark of something else. Excitement. The astronomy tower at midnight was a place where the world felt thin, as if the veil between the solid stone of Hogwarts and the infinite cold of the cosmos had been worn sheer by centuries of stargazing. The wind here was not merely air. It was a living, breathing entity, biting at exposed skin with the sharpness of winter's end. Hermione Granger wrapped her scarf tighter around her neck, her breath misting in the silver light of the waxing gibbous moon. The climb had been arduous, a spiraling ascent through the silent castle that had given her entirely too much time to think. Her mind, usually a well-ordered archive of facts and contingencies, was currently a chaotic storm of anxiety. She reached the top landing and paused in the shadow of the archway, her hand resting on the rough stone. He was already there. Draco Malfoy stood by the crenellated parapet, his back to her, silhouetted against the sprawling tapestry of the forbidden forest below. He wasn't wearing his teaching robes. Instead, he was dressed in a thick charcoal grey wool jumper and black trousers, a departure from his usual armoured aesthetic that made him look unsettlingly human. The wind whipped his platinum hair around his face, but he stood with a stillness that suggested he was barely breathing. Hermione watched him for a moment, unseen. This was the enemy. This was the boy who had mocked her teeth, her blood, her very existence. And yet, when her magic had touched his in the great hall, it hadn't recoiled. It had sung. It had felt like sliding into a bath of warm water after a long walk in the snow. That betrayal of her own instincts terrified her more than any curse. She stepped out of the shadows. "You're early." Draco didn't jump. He turned slowly, leaning his elbows back against the stone ledge. His face was pale in the moonlight, the sharp angles of his cheekbones casting long shadows. "And you're punctual to a fault, Granger. It's unnerving." "It's efficient," she corrected, walking to the center of the tower floor. She set her bag down with a heavy thud, trying to claim the space. "Have you reviewed the exercises McGonagall sent?" "The harmonic resonance drills," Draco scoffed, pushing off the wall and walking toward her. His movements were languid, prowling. "Yes. Essentially, she wants us to meditate until our chakras align or some such hippie nonsense. I feel ridiculous just thinking about it." "It's not nonsense. It's ancient arithmancy applied to biomagical fields," Hermione snapped, grateful for the familiar ground of academic debate. It was a shield she knew how to wield. "We need to synchronize our breathing, and then attempt to cast a simple lumos simultaneously. If our cores are aligned, the lights should merge. And if they're not, then we'll likely blind ourselves, or blow up a turret." Draco stopped a few feet away from her. The air between them instantly tightened, that familiar hum of static electricity rising on her skin. He looked at her, really looked at her, his grey eyes stripping away her defences. "Fine," he muttered. "Let's get this over with. I have a flask of fire whiskey in my quarters calling my name, and I can't drink it if I'm blind." He drew his wand. Hermione drew hers, the hawthorn and the vinewood, dark and light. "Face each other," Hermione instructed, her voice steady despite the flutter in her pulse. "Close your eyes. We need to clear our minds." "My mind is a fortress, Granger. It's always clear." "Then lower the drawbridge, Malfoy. We can't sink if you're occluding." She saw his jaw tighten. For a legilimens like Draco, opening his mind was anathema. It was weakness. But he let out a sharp exhale through his nose and nodded. "On 3, she whispered. They stood in the freezing wind, wands raised, eyes closed. 1, 2, 3, lumos. Lumos. 2 distinct flares of light erupted. One was a harsh, clinical blue-white, the other was a warm, flickering yellow. They hovered at the tips of their wands, fighting for dominance. The space between them crackled with dissonance, a high-pitched whining sound like a mosquito in the ear. The lights didn't merge. They repelled, sputtering and spitting sparks that burned when they landed on the stone floor. "Stop!" Hermione gasped, opening her eyes. "Nox!" The lights vanished, leaving spots dancing in her vision. The silence that followed was heavy with frustration. "Well," Draco deadpanned, examining his wand tip. "That went swimmingly. I think we managed to annoy the local bats, if nothing else." "You're blocking me," Hermione accused, stepping closer. "I can feel it. You're putting up a wall the moment the magic starts to flow. You're afraid." "I am not afraid," Draco snapped, his voice rising. "I am cautious. There is a difference. You're pushing too hard, Granger. You're trying to force the connection like you force everything else, through sheer willpower. Magic isn't a textbook you can memorize into submission. And you're treating it like a poison you have to swallow," she shouted back. The wind picked up, whipping her hair across her face. She pushed it back angrily. "We have to be vulnerable, Draco. That's the point. The ethereal weaver requires trust." "Trust?" He laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. He took a menacing step toward her, closing the distance until he was looming over her. "You want me to trust you? After everything? You want me to open my mind to the person who has every reason to destroy me?" "I don't want to destroy you," Hermione cried, looking up at him. "I'm trying to save this project. I'm trying to—" "Why?" He cut her off, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Why do you care? Why didn't you refuse the assignment? You could have. McGonagall would have listened to you. You're the golden girl. You didn't have to be stuck here with me." The question hung in the cold air, raw and exposed. Hermione stared at him. She saw the self-loathing etched into the lines around his mouth. She saw the fear that he was unlovable, redeemable only in theory, but never in practice. "Because," she whispered, the truth slipping out before she could check it. "Because when we touched on the platform, for the first time in years, I didn't feel alone. And I think you felt it too." Draco's eyes widened slightly. The wind seemed to die down, leaving them in a vacuum of silence. He didn't mock her. He didn't sneer. He just stared, as if he were seeing a ghost. "Granger," he breathed, his voice cracking. "Try again," she said softly. She holstered her wand. "No magic this time. Just contact. Physical contact helps ground the connection. That's what the texts say." She held out her hands, palms up. Her fingers were trembling. Draco looked at her hands as if they were weapons. He hesitated, his internal conflict playing out across his features, the desire to run warring with the desperate, starving need to touch. Slowly, agonizingly, he reached out. His hands were cold, his fingers long and elegant. As his skin brushed hers, a shockwave went through them both. It wasn't painful, it was a jolt of pure recognition. He gasped, his fingers curling around hers, gripping tight. "Close your eyes," Hermione whispered, though she couldn't bring herself to close her own. She was captivated by the look on his face. Eyes squeezed shut, head tipped back, lips parted as he inhaled sharply. The magic rose up without a spell. It started at their joined hands, a soft, golden glow that seeped from her skin into his. But this time, it was different. It wasn't just light, it was feeling. Hermione felt a rush of cold air, the smell of rain on stone, the sensation of falling. Draco's magic. It was turbulent, dark, and beautiful, a storm trapped in a bottle. She felt his guilt, a heavy, leaden weight in his gut. She felt his exhaustion. But beneath that, buried deep under the ice, she felt a burning, intense heat, a yearning for peace, for forgiveness, for her. The realization hit her like a physical blow. He wanted her, not just as a colleague, not just as a rival. He wanted her approval, her presence. And then the flow reversed. Draco's eyes snapped open. He was looking at her with shock. He was feeling her, her anxiety, the pressure of being perfect, the loneliness of the pedestal everyone put her on, the way her heart sped up whenever he walked into a room. Hermione, he said, the name sounding foreign and intimate on his tongue. The golden light around their hands flared brighter, expanding, wrapping around them like a cocoon. The wind outside the tower howled, but inside the circle of their magic, it was warm, quiet, safe. He stepped closer. He had to. The magic was pulling them again, winding them together. They were chest to chest now, their hands still locked between them. Hermione looked up into his eyes. The grey was swirling with flecks of gold. He looked terrified. He looked beautiful. "You're so loud," he whispered, shaking his head slightly. "Your mind, it never stops. It's chaotic." "And you're so cold," she countered, her voice trembling. "But you're burning underneath." Draco let go of one of her hands to reach up. His fingers hovered for a second before brushing a stray curl away from her cheek. His touch was tentative, reverent. His thumb grazed her jawline, sending shivers cascading down her spine. "This is dangerous," he murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips. "This, whatever this is, it's not just the Weaver, is it?" "No," Hermione breathed, leaning into his touch instinctively. "I don't think it is." The tension was excruciating. It was a precipice. One move, 1 inch closer, and they would fall. The magic pulsed around them, urging them on, a heartbeat that wasn't hers and wasn't his, but theirs. Draco leaned down. His breath ghosted over her lips, smelling of mint and darkness. Hermione's eyelids fluttered shut. She tilted her head back, surrendering to the pull. Clang. The clock tower bell tolled the quarter hour, a deep, booming sound that shattered the silence. Draco flinched as if struck. He pulled back abruptly, breaking the physical contact. The warmth vanished instantly, replaced by the biting wind. The golden light winked out, plunging them back into the blue shadows of the night. He stumbled back a few steps, his chest heaving. He looked at his hands, then at her, his expression twisting back into a mask of panic and defense. That was... He swallowed hard, running a hand through his hair, messing up the perfect strands. That was too much. We went too fast. Hermione stood frozen, bereft. The loss of his touch felt like a physical amputation. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering violently. "Draco." "No," he said, holding up a hand. He wouldn't look at her. He couldn't. "That's enough for tonight. We synced. McGonagall will be pleased. I have to go." "Don't run away," she pleaded softly. He paused at the archway, half in shadow. He turned his head, looking at her over his shoulder. The hunger was still there in his eyes, raw and terrifying, but the walls were back up. "I'm not running, Granger," he lied, his voice hollow. "I'm retreating to a strategic position. There's a difference." And then he was gone, his footsteps echoing rapidly down the spiral stairs, leaving Hermione alone with the stars and the lingering, burning ghost of his touch on her skin. She touched her cheek where his thumb had rested. It was still warm. Slowly, Hermione sank onto the cold stone floor, pulling her knees to her chest. She looked out at the forbidden forest, where the darkness seemed endless. Complimentary, she whispered to the wind, testing the word. It didn't feel like a compliment. It felt like a collision. And she had the terrible, sinking suspicion that she wasn't going to survive the impact. 3 days. It had been 3 days since the incident in the astronomy tower, and the silence between them was louder than any scream. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a pressurized vacuum, sucking the air out of the castle corridors whenever they happened to be in the same wing. Hermione sat at her desk in the charms classroom, a stack of second-year essays on the hovering charm ignored in front of her. Outside, the Scottish spring had turned treacherous. Rain lashed against the high Gothic windows in sheets, distorting the view of the grounds into a grey, weeping blur. The sound was a relentless drumming, a rhythm that matched the dull, persistent ache behind her sternum. She rubbed her chest absently. It wasn't a heart condition. It was a proximity alert. Since that night, since the moment their magic had mingled and he had touched her cheek, the connection had mutated. It was no longer just a hum when they were close. It was a physical craving when they were apart. It felt like caffeine withdrawal, mixed with the phantom sensation of a missing limb. When Draco was on the other side of the castle, she felt cold, lethargic, her magic sluggish and unresponsive. When he moved closer, even if he was floors away, the warmth returned, spiking into a fever that made her hands tremble. And he knew it. She knew he knew it. She had seen him only once, yesterday in the staff room. He had walked in, taken one look at her, turned on his heel, and walked out. He looked terrible, paler than usual, with dark bruises of exhaustion under his eyes and a tension in his jaw that looked painful. He was starving himself, starving them both. Hermione pushed her chair back, the wood scraping harshly against the stone floor. She couldn't take it anymore. The logic that usually governed her life had been incinerated by the raw, chaotic need to stop hurting. If he wouldn't come to the practice sessions, he had skipped Tuesday, she would bring the practice to him. She grabbed her cloak and the heavy box containing the research notes for the ethereal weaver. She didn't need a map to find him. She just had to follow the pull. The library at night was a cathedral of shadows. The air smelled of vanilla, dust, and decaying parchment. The restricted section was gated, the iron bars twisted into shapes of snarling wolves and dragons, but they melted away at the touch of her wand. He was there. Draco was sitting at a secluded table in the farthest corner, surrounded by towers of books that looked precarious enough to kill a man. A single floating candle cast a sickly yellow light over his features. He was reading, or pretending to. His eyes were fixed on a page of archaic soul bonds and their consequences, but he hadn't turned the page in the 2 minutes she had been watching him from the shadows. As she stepped into the circle of candlelight, the air in the room shifted. The temperature rose 5 degrees instantly. The dull ache in Hermione's chest evaporated, replaced by a rush of endorphins so potent she almost staggered. Draco didn't look up. His knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of the table. "Go away, Granger," he rasped. His voice was wrecked, as if he hadn't used it in days. "No," Hermione said, placing her heavy box on the table with a deliberate thud. She pulled out the chair opposite him and sat down. "You missed our session on Tuesday. McGonagall is asking questions. Tell her I have dragonpox. Tell her I've been splinched. Tell her anything," he snapped, finally looking up. The sight of him stole the breath from her lungs. Up close, the damage was undeniable. His eyes were bloodshot, the grey iris blown wide, swallowing the pupil. He looked like a man in the grip of a fever. He looked exactly how she felt. "I'm not lying for you, Draco," she said softly, using his name like a weapon. "And I'm not going to let you kill yourself out of stubbornness. Look at you. You're shaking." "I am not." He tried to lift his hand to gesture, but it was indeed trembling violently. He slammed it back down on the table, cursing under his breath. "This is unnatural. It's a parasite. It's feeding on us." "It's not feeding on us. It's trying to balance us," Hermione argued, leaning forward. The pull was stronger now, a magnetic tide dragging her toward him. She wanted to reach across the table. She wanted to smooth the hair back from his forehead. "We opened a door, Draco. You can't just slam it shut because you don't like what's on the other side." "I don't like what's on the other side?" He let out a harsh, incredulous laugh. He stood up abruptly, his chair toppling over with a crash that echoed through the silent stacks. "You think this is about preference? Granger, look at who I am. Look at my arm." He didn't pull up his sleeve, but the gesture was there. The mark, the ghost of it. "I am a ruin," he hissed, backing away from her until his back hit the shelves. "I am darkness, bitterness, and regret. You are you." He waved a hand at her, frustrated. "You are light. You are the future. This connection? It's a cosmic joke. It's trying to mix oil and water, and all it's doing is making a mess." "That's fear talking." Hermione stood up too, skirting the table to approach him. "You're terrified that if you let this happen, if you actually connect with someone, you might lose the only identity you have left. The tragic, isolated villain." "Don't psychoanalyze me," he roared. The magic reacted to his anger. The books on the shelves rattled violently. A gust of wind swept through the aisle, extinguishing the candle and plunging them into darkness. But it wasn't dark. Not for them. In the sudden absence of light, the bond between them flared visible. A shimmering, translucent thread of gold pulse between her chest and his, illuminating the space with a soft, ethereal glow. It wasn't a string. It was a lifeline. Draco stared down at the glowing bond, his face twisted in horror and awe. "It's visible," he whispered. "It's never been visible before." "It's because we're fighting it," Hermione said, her voice trembling. She took a step closer. The golden light intensified, casting stark shadows on his face. "Draco, please. It hurts. I know it hurts you too." "If I touch you," he murmured, looking at her with a devastation that broke her heart. "I don't think I'll be able to let go, and I will drag you down with me. That is what Malfoys do. We ruin beautiful things." "I am not a thing to be ruined," Hermione said, fierce, closing the final distance. "I am a woman who is making a choice. Stop deciding for me." She reached out and took his hand. The relief was instantaneous and overwhelming. Draco gasped, his knees buckling. He slumped forward, and Hermione caught him, her arms going around his waist to hold him up. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, letting out a long, shuddering groan that vibrated through her entire body. The pain vanished. The cold vanished. The world narrowed down to the heat of his body against hers, the smell of rain and cedar, the frantic beating of his heart against her chest. Merlin. He breathed against her skin, his hands clutching at the back of her robes, bunching the fabric in desperate fists. It stops. It finally stopped. "I know," Hermione whispered, running her hands up his back, feeling the tension slowly bleed out of his muscles. She rested her cheek against his hair. "I know." They stood there in the dark library, illuminated only by the glow of their own souls, holding each other like survivors of a shipwreck. It wasn't sexual, not yet. It was something far more intimate. It was sustenance. It was the feeling of a lock clicking into place. Draco pulled back slightly, just enough to look at her. His face was inches from hers. The shadows softened his sharp features, making him look young and vulnerable. "How do you do that?" he asked quietly. "Do what?" "Look at me like you don't see the monster." Hermione reached up, tracing the line of his jaw with her thumb. The stubble was rough against her skin. "Maybe because I'm looking at the man who saved me in the astronomy tower. The man who is afraid of hurting me. Monsters don't worry about collateral damage, Draco." He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. "You are infuriatingly logical. And you are dramatically emotional." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. It was small, fragile, but real. "So," he whispered, opening his eyes. The grey was clear now, the storm settled. "What do we do? We can't stay in the restricted section hugging forever. Pince will skin us." "We finish the project," Hermione said firmly, though she didn't let go of him. "We stop fighting the bond. We use it. We stabilize the ethereal weaver. Maybe once the task is done, the magic will be satisfied. Maybe it will fade." Draco's expression tightened. A flash of something like pain crossed his eyes at the mention of the bond fading. "Right. The mission. Fix the artifact. Break the bond. Back to normal." "Is that what you want?" Hermione asked, searching his face. "Back to normal? Back to ignoring each other in the corridors?" Draco looked at her, his gaze dropping to her mouth, then back up to her eyes. The hunger was there again, simmering beneath the surface, but controlled now. "I want you to be safe, Granger, even from me." "I can take care of myself," she said. "I know," he replied softly. He stepped back, the loss of contact sending a sharp pang of cold through her, but he kept one hand on her arm, maintaining the circuit. "Come on. If we're going to do this, we need to do it properly. No more running." "No more running," she agreed. He hesitated, then squeezed her arm gently. "And Granger." "Yes?" "Thank you for coming to find me." He turned and summoned the fallen candle, relighting it with a snap of his fingers. The moment of raw vulnerability was over, tucked away behind the walls he was rebuilding, but the foundation had shifted. As they walked out of the library together, the golden thread between them was invisible again, but Hermione could feel it. It was no longer a tether dragging them together against their will. It was a lifeline, and for the first time, she wasn't sure she ever wanted it to break. The walk to the dungeons, where Draco insisted they could work without McGonagall spying on them, was quiet but companionable. The castle seemed to approve. The staircases didn't move. The torches burned brighter as they passed. "My quarters are not exactly Gryffindor Tower," Draco warned as they reached a stretch of bare stone wall in the depths of the dungeon. "Try not to judge the lack of red and gold." "I think I can manage," Hermione said dryly. He murmured a password, absolution, and the walls slid aside. Hermione stepped in and stopped. She had expected cold stone, dark velvet, perhaps a display of dark artifacts. Instead, the room was warm. A fire roared in the grate. The walls were lined with books, thousands of them, chaotic and overflowing, unlike the pristine order of the library. There was a worn leather armchair by the fire with a throw blanket that looked suspiciously like it had been knitted by a Weasley. A half-finished game of wizard's chess sat on a side table. It was messy. It was lived in. It was lonely. "It's nice," she said, surprised. "Don't sound so shocked," Draco muttered, moving to clear a stack of parchment from the coffee table. "I do have hobbies other than brooding and polishing my collection of villainous capes." Hermione laughed, a genuine, bubbling sound that seemed to startle the room. Draco looked over his shoulder at her, and the look on his face, caught somewhere between surprise and quiet adoration, made her breath catch. "Right," he said, clearing his throat and turning away to hide his expression. "The weaver. Let's look at the schematics. If we're going to weave reality, we should probably figure out which thread goes where." Hermione moved to join him, sitting on the rug by the fire. As she settled next to him, their shoulders brushed. Neither of them pulled away. The storm outside battered the castle walls, but in the heart of the dungeons, for the first time in years, the silence wasn't heavy. It was full of possibility. But even as she opened the book, Hermione felt a prickle of unease. The bond was stable, yes. But looking at the complex diagrams of the artifact, she realized something McGonagall hadn't told them. The weaver didn't just require two people. It required a sacrifice. "Draco," she said, her finger tracing a rune in the corner of the page. "Look at this, the energy source." Draco leaned in, his hair brushing her cheek. "Sanguis et anima," he read, his voice dropping. "Blood and soul." He went still. "It doesn't run on ambient magic," he whispered, the color draining from his face again. "It runs on the bond itself. It consumes the connection to repair the fabric." They looked at each other. The implication was terrifyingly clear. To fix the world, they wouldn't just have to work together. They would have to pour this new, fragile, overwhelming thing growing between them into the machine. And the machine would eat it. "If we do this," Hermione whispered, horror dawning on her, "it might burn the bond out completely. We'll go back to being nothing." Draco stared at the diagram, his expression unreadable. "Or," he said slowly, "it might take everything else with it." The fire in the grate had burned down to embers, casting a deep, pulsating orange glow across the room that mirrored the rhythmic throbbing of the bond between them. The diagram of the ethereal weaver lay open on the rug, the ink black and damning, staring up at them like a death sentence. "Sanguis et anima." Hermione sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by a fortress of open books she had summoned from Draco's shelves. Her hair was a chaotic halo of curls, her quill moving frantically across a scrap of parchment. She was doing what she did best, fighting the impossible with logic. "There has to be a bypass," she muttered, the scratch of her quill loud in the silence. The runic structure is based on an equivalency exchange. If we can substitute the binding agent, perhaps dragon blood mixed with crushed moonstone to simulate the magical frequency of a soul bond, we could trick the artifact into accepting a synthetic fuel source. Granger, Draco said. He was sitting in the armchair, a tumbler of amber liquid resting untouched on his knee. He hadn't moved in 20 minutes. He had just been watching her. Or maybe we can invert the polarity of the intake valve, she continued, her voice rising in pitch, brittle with panic. If we feed it raw ambient magic from the ley lines beneath the castle, we can act as conduits rather than batteries. It would be painful, yes, but it wouldn't consume the connection. It wouldn't... Hermione. The use of her first name, spoken with a quiet, devastating finality, silenced her. She stopped writing. The quill trembled in her hand, dripping a single blot of ink onto the parchment, a black tear. She didn't look up. She couldn't. If she looked at him, the delicate architecture of her denial would collapse. "It's not going to work," Draco said softly. He leaned forward, setting the glass down on the floor. He reached out, his hand entering her field of vision, pale, scarred, beautiful, and gently took the quill from her fingers. He laid it aside. "You know it. I know it. This is old magic. It doesn't want chemistry. It wants sacrifice." Hermione finally looked at him. Her eyes were swimming with unshed tears, reflecting the dying embers. "I can't accept that. I can't accept that we found this thing, this impossible compatibility, only to feed it into a machine and burn it to ash. Isn't that the irony of it?" Draco let out a breathless, mirthless laugh. He slid off the chair to sit on the rug opposite her, his long legs brushing against hers. The contact sent a jolt of warmth through the bond, a stark reminder of what they were about to lose. The universe brings together the two people who hate each other most, proves they are perfect for each other, and then says, "Congratulations, now die to save the world." It's poetic, really, in a twisted, dark sort of way. "It's not poetic," Hermione hissed, grabbing his wrists. Her grip was tight, desperate. "It's cruel. Draco, if we do this, if the Weaver takes the bond, what happens to us?" Draco looked down at her hands, gripping his wrists. He turned his hands over, intertwining their fingers. His skin was cool, but the magic beneath it was scorching hot. "Best case scenario?" he murmured, his thumb rubbing over her knuckles. "The bond is drained. The connection snaps. We go back to being strangers. We wake up tomorrow, and I'm just the ex-Death Eater potions master, and you're just the Gryffindor princess. The warmth goes away. The silence comes back. And the worst case," she whispered. "The worst case is that the bond is too strong to be drained without taking the vessels with it," he said, meeting her eyes. "We burn out, like moth wings in a candle flame." Hermione let out a shuddering breath. "And you're willing to do that? You're willing to risk it?" Draco was silent for a long moment. He looked around the room, his sanctuary of shadows and books, and then back at her. The mask was completely gone now. There was no sneer, no bravado, just a naked, terrifying honesty. "I have spent my entire adult life cold, Hermione," he confessed, his voice rough. "I thought that was just how the world was. Grey, muted. And then you cast a stunner at me, and suddenly everything was gold. It was warm." He squeezed her hands. "I don't want to go back to the cold. But if the choice is between the world tearing itself apart or me losing this. I have to choose the world, because you live in it." The admission hung in the air, heavy and sweet. Because you live in it. Something inside Hermione broke. The logical barriers, the fears of propriety, the ghosts of the past, they all shattered. "I don't want to be safe in a world where we're strangers," she said fiercely. She moved before she thought. She pulled her hands free, surged forward, and framed his face with her palms. Draco went still, his eyes widening in shock, but he didn't pull away. He leaned into her touch, a starving man offered bread. "Hermione," he started, a warning or a plea, she didn't know. She cut him off by pressing her lips to his. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It wasn't the tentative, accidental brushes they had shared in the astronomy tower. This was deliberate. It was an impact. For a split second, Draco hesitated. His body was rigid, caught between the instinct to protect himself and the overwhelming need to surrender. Then he broke. A low growl vibrated in his chest. His arms came around her, wrapping her in a crushing embrace, hauling her against him. One hand tangled in her hair, angling her head back, deepening the kiss until it felt less like affection and more like possession. The bond exploded. It wasn't just a hum anymore. It was a symphony. Golden light flared around them, so bright it drowned out the fire. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with ozone and static. Books rattled on the shelves. The glass on the floor cracked. Hermione didn't care. She was drowning in him. He tasted of fire whiskey and despair. He felt solid and real and hers. Her magic reached out, intertwining with his, not just sinking, but fusing. It was a sensation of total completeness, a puzzle piece snapping into place after years of being lost. Draco pulled back, gasping for air, his forehead resting against hers. His eyes were closed, his lashes fluttering against his cheeks. "You realize," he panted, his voice wrecked, "that you are making this infinitely harder. If we have to lose this tomorrow, how am I supposed to survive knowing what it tastes like?" "Then don't let go," Hermione whispered, running her hands down his chest, feeling the frantic hammer of his heart. "We go in there tomorrow. We fix the Weaver, but we hold on. We fight for the bond, Draco. We don't let it eat us. We force it to take only what we give it." Draco opened his eyes. The grey was swallowed by black pupils, burning with a fierce, terrified resolve. "You think you can outstubborn an ancient magical artifact?" "I'm Hermione Granger," she said, a tear finally escaping to track down her cheek. "I can outstubborn anything." He stared at her, and slowly a look of profound wonder softened his features. He reached up, wiping the tear away with his thumb. "I believe you," he whispered. "Gods, help me. I actually believe you." He kissed her again, softer this time, but with a desperate, aching tenderness. He kissed her like he was memorizing the shape of her mouth, the texture of her skin. He kissed her as if she were the only anchor keeping him from drifting into the void. They didn't move from the rug. The fire died down completely, leaving them in the dark, illuminated only by the faint, pulsing glow of the bond that wrapped around them like a shared heartbeat. They lay down together, fully clothed, tangled in a chaotic embrace of limbs and robes. Draco pulled the Weasley-knitted blanket off the chair and threw it over them. He pulled her back against his chest, his chin resting on the top of her head, his arms locking her in place. "Sleep," he commanded softly, though his voice was strained. "We need the energy." "I can't sleep," Hermione murmured, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. Just close your eyes. I've got you. And surprisingly, she did. The proximity of his magic acted like a sedative. The anxiety that had been clawing at her throat for days began to recede, smoothed over by the steady, dark current of his presence. She drifted off with the scent of him filling her lungs and the terrifying realization that she had fallen in love with Draco Malfoy in the span of a single lunar cycle. The morning came too soon. It arrived not with sunlight, but with a grey, oppressive dawn that filtered through the high windows of the dungeons. Hermione woke to the feeling of cold. She sat up with a start. The space beside her was empty. The blanket was tucked carefully around her shoulders. The fire was dead ash. "Draco!" she called out, panic seizing her throat. "I'm here." He was standing by the door, already dressed in his dueling robes, the same black fitted ones from the tournament. He was fastening his dragon hide braces, his movements sharp and precise. He looked different. The vulnerability of the night before had been packed away, locked behind a fortress of occlumency, so thick she could feel the chill of it from across the room. His face was a mask of marble. "Draco!" She stood up, the blanket pooling at her feet. "What's wrong? You're blocking me." "I'm focusing," he said, his voice flat. He didn't look at her. "We have an hour. McGonagall is meeting us in the Chamber of Secrets. It's the only place secure enough to contain the magical fallout if things go wrong." "The chamber?" Hermione shuddered. "Why there?" "Because if the Weaver explodes, it's better it takes down a cavern under the lake than the student dormitories," he stated coldly. Finally, he looked at her. His eyes were like steel. "Get dressed, Granger. We have a world to save." Hermione stared at him, hurt, stinging her eyes. He was pushing her away. He was preparing for the severance. He was already saying goodbye. She stiffened, swallowing the hurt. If he needed armor to do this, she would let him wear it. But she wouldn't wear hers. She needed him to feel her resolve. "Fine," she said, her voice steady. She summoned her own robes with a flick of her wand. "But remember what I said last night. We hold on." Draco turned away, reaching for the heavy wooden box containing the Weaver. His knuckles were white. "I remember," he said, his voice barely audible. He lifted the box. It was heavy, but he carried it as if it weighed nothing. Or perhaps as if the weight of it was the only thing keeping him grounded. "After you," he said, gesturing to the door. Hermione walked past him. As she did, she reached out with her magic, trying to brush against his mind to find the warmth. She found nothing but a wall. A high, cold, impenetrable wall. But deep down, buried beneath the stone, she felt a single, terrified tremor. He wasn't blocking her because he didn't care. He was blocking her because he cared too much, and he was planning something he knew she wouldn't like. The realization made her blood run cold. He's going to do it, she thought, her heart hammering as they stepped out into the corridor. He's going to try to take the damage alone. She gripped her wand. "Not if I have anything to say about it." Together, they walked into the shadows of the dungeon, two compatible souls marching toward a machine designed to tear them apart. The Chamber of Secrets did not smell of death anymore. It smelled of deep, stagnant water and the heavy metallic tang of ozone. The vast cavern, with its towering pillars carved into the likeness of serpents, stretched away into the gloom, lit only by the eerie bioluminescent moss clinging to the damp stone ceiling. Hermione's footsteps echoed wetly as she stepped off the slide, her boots sinking slightly into the silt-covered floor. Beside her, Draco moved like a wraith, his black robes blending into the shadows. He hadn't spoken since they left the dungeons. His occlumency shields were so impenetrable that standing next to him felt like standing next to a statue, cold, beautiful, and utterly hollow. "Over here," came McGonagall's voice, tight with tension. The headmistress stood near the mouth of the Salazar Slytherin statue. A heavy stone altar had been transfigured from the debris, and upon it sat the ethereal weaver. Freed from its box, the artifact was terrifying to behold. It wasn't a loom in the traditional sense. It was a chaotic sphere of spinning bronze rings and floating crystals, humming with a sound that vibrated in the teeth. Inside the sphere, raw, jagged tears of white light, the damaged threads of reality, were thrashing like trapped birds. "The instability has increased," McGonagall said, her face pale in the artifact's glow. She looked at Draco, then Hermione. "The containment fields are failing. If you are going to do this, it must be now." Draco stepped forward, placing his wand on the left side of the altar. He didn't look at Hermione. "We're ready." "Draco," Hermione whispered, reaching for his arm. He flinched away before she could make contact, stepping into his designated circle of runes. "Position, Granger. Don't let your concentration slip." Hermione swallowed the lump of hurt in her throat. She stepped into the opposing circle on the right side of the altar. The distance between them was only 5 feet, but the emotional chasm felt infinite. "Begin," McGonagall commanded, raising her own wand to cast a perimeter shield around them. Draco raised his hawthorn wand. Hermione raised her vinewood. "Connexio Aetherius," they intoned in unison. The spell hit the spinning sphere. The reaction was instantaneous. The weaver stopped spinning with a violent screech of metal on metal. The crystals flared blindingly bright, and then 2 thick, translucent cables of energy shot out from the artifact, latching onto their chests. Hermione gasped as the air left her lungs. It didn't feel like a spell. It felt like a hook sinking into her sternum. The machine wasn't just connecting to her magic. It was connecting to her. It pulled at her memories, her fears, her very essence. Across the altar, Draco hissed through his teeth, his head thrown back, the veins in his neck standing out against his pale skin. "Stabilize the feed," he shouted over the rising hum of the machine. "It's hungry." Hermione grit her teeth, planting her feet. She pushed back against the pull, feeding her magic into the cable with controlled precision. She visualized the bond, that warm, golden thread that connected her to Draco, and tried to use it as a bridge to balance the load. But the bridge was blocked. Draco was walling her off. He was taking the full brunt of the Weaver's demand on his side, refusing to let the energy flow between them. "Draco, stop!" Hermione screamed, feeling the imbalance immediately. The artifact began to tilt, the bronze rings spinning wildly towards his side. "You can't handle the intake alone. It will burn you out." "I have it under control," he roared back, though his voice was shaking. He didn't. Hermione could see it. The cable attached to his chest was turning a dark, angry red. The magic was stripping him. He was feeding the machine not just his power, but his life force, trying to satisfy its hunger so it wouldn't take from her. He was sacrificing himself, just as she had feared. "No," Hermione snarled. Panic was replaced by a cold, furious clarity. She was not going to let him become a martyr. She was not going to let him leave her alone in the cold. She dropped her shields completely. Instead of pulling back, she pushed. She poured everything she had, her love, her stubbornness, her fear, her desire, down the bond, slamming against his mental walls with the force of a battering ram. "Let me in." Draco staggered, his eyes snapping open to lock onto hers. "Granger, don't—" "You are not dying today, Draco Malfoy." Her voice echoed in his head, louder than the machine. "We do this together, or we don't do it at all." She didn't wait for his permission. She forced the synchronization. She reached out with her free hand, across the altar, through the sparks and the swirling energy. "Take my hand," she screamed. Draco looked at her hand, then at the machine that was slowly killing him. He looked at the blood starting to trickle from his nose. "It will hurt you," he choked out, the tears finally spilling over. "Hermione, please, let me do this one good thing." "Loving me isn't a weakness, you idiot," she cried, tears streaming down her own face. "It's the fuel. The machine needs the bond, not just the power. Give it to me." Something in his face crumbled. The resolve broke, replaced by a desperate, agonized longing. He couldn't deny her. He never could. With a ragged cry, Draco reached out. Their fingers brushed, then locked. The world went white. The sound of the machine vanished. The damp cold of the chamber vanished. There was no pain, no fear. There was only them. Hermione felt him. Not just his magic, but the entirety of his soul. She felt the jagged edges of his regret, the cold hollow of his loneliness, and the fierce, burning inferno of his love for her. A love he had tried to bury under layers of sarcasm and silence. And he felt her. He felt her anxiety, her need to fix everything, and the absolute, unshakable certainty that she belonged with him. The weaver roared to life, but it wasn't a screech anymore. It was a song. The red cable on Draco's chest turned pure, blinding gold. The white cable on Hermione's chest matched it. The energy flowed in a perfect loop, from Hermione to Draco, into the machine, and back again. They were no longer two batteries. They were a circuit, a single, infinite loop of power. The jagged tiers of light inside the sphere began to weave together. The broken threads of reality knit themselves shut, stitched by the golden light of their shared magic. "It's working!" McGonagall's voice sounded miles away, distorted by the power surging through the room. But Hermione couldn't look away from Draco. They were floating now, suspended inches off the ground by the sheer density of the magic surrounding them. His eyes were fixed on hers, grey swirling into gold, terrified and awestruck. "I can feel you," he whispered, his voice resonating directly in her mind. "Every part of you." "I've got you," she whispered back, squeezing his hand so hard her bones ached. "I'm not letting go." The weaver began to spin faster and faster, a blurring star in the center of the dark chamber. The demand for power increased. It wanted more. It wanted the final piece to seal the rift. It wanted the climax. "Together!" Draco shouted, sensing the pull. He didn't try to shield her this time. He drew on her strength, and she drew on his. They pushed. They poured the culmination of the last month. The banter, the tension, the touch in the tower, the kiss by the fire, into the spell. They gave the machine the very thing that made them impossible, their compatibility. The artifact let out a final resonant chime that shook the pillars of the chamber. A shockwave of pure, condensed reality exploded outward. The connection severed. Hermione was thrown backward. The breath was knocked out of her as she hit the silt-covered floor, rolling to a stop against the stone foot of a serpent statue. Silence fell. Absolute, ringing silence. The light was gone. The weaver sat motionless on the altar, its bronze rings still, the crystals dark and dormant. The air was clear. The ozone smell was replaced by the clean, sharp scent of rain. Hermione lay there for a moment, staring up at the dark ceiling, gasping for air. Her body felt heavy, drained, as if she had run a marathon. Her magic felt quiet, too quiet. "Draco," she rasped. She pushed herself up on trembling arms. Draco was lying on the other side of the altar. He wasn't moving. "Draco!" The scream tore from her throat, raw and terrified. She scrambled to her feet, ignoring the dizziness that threatened to topple her, and ran to him. She fell to her knees in the dirt beside him, her hands frantically searching for a pulse. He was pale, deathly pale. The blood from his nose had dried on his lip. His eyes were closed. "No, no, no!" Hermione chanted, pressing her fingers to his neck. "You promised. You said you'd hold on." There was a faint, thready flutter beneath her fingertips. "He is alive," McGonagall said, appearing beside her. The headmistress looked shaken, her tartan robes singed at the edges. She waved her wand over Draco, running a diagnostic spell. A soft blue light hovered over his chest. Magical exhaustion. Severe. But his core is intact. Hermione slumped, a sob breaking free from her chest. She grabbed Draco's hand, the same hand she had held during the ritual, and pressed it to her cheek. It was cold, limp. "Wake up," she whispered fiercely. "The world is saved, you dramatic prat. Wake up." Draco didn't stir, but then she felt it. It was faint, weak, but it was there, a tiny, flickering ember of warmth in the back of her mind, a ghost of a sensation. Pain, tired, softness, the bond. It hadn't burned out. It was battered, bruised, and quiet, but it was still there. The weaver hadn't eaten it. It had been fed, and it had left the source alive. Hermione closed her eyes, pouring every ounce of her remaining strength into that tiny flicker. "I'm here. I'm right here." Draco's brow twitched. A low groan escaped his lips. His fingers twitched against her cheek. "Granger?" he mumbled, his voice a barely audible slur. "I'm here," she sobbed, laughing through the tears. She brushed the hair off his forehead, heedless of the dirt on her hands. "I'm right here." Draco cracked one eye open. The grey was dull, hazy, but focused on her. He tried to smile, but it looked more like a grimace. "Did we win?" "Yes," Hermione whispered, leaning down to press her forehead against his. "We won." "Good," he breathed, his eyes slipping shut again. "Because I think I'm going to sleep for a week." "Sleep," she soothed, stroking his cheek. "I'll be here when you wake up." "Hermione." "Yes?" "You were very loud inside my head." Hermione let out a wet, shaky laugh. "Sorry." "Don't be," he murmured, drifting off as unconsciousness claimed him again. It was bright. Hermione stayed on her knees in the mud of the Chamber of Secrets, holding the unconscious form of her former enemy, while Headmistress McGonagall quietly began to pack away the dormant artifact. The danger was over. The reality of the world was fixed. But as Hermione looked down at Draco's face, peaceful in the gloom, she knew that her own reality had irrevocably changed. The bond hummed softly between them, a golden thread in the dark, no longer a chain, but a promise. They had survived the fire. Now, they just had to survive the aftermath. The hospital wing was drowning in sunlight. It wasn't the harsh, exposing glare of the dueling platform, nor the bioluminescent gloom of the chamber. It was a soft, golden afternoon haze that poured through the high windows, turning the dust motes dancing in the air into suspended flecks of gold. Hermione sat in the uncomfortable wooden chair beside the bed, her head resting on her folded arms on the mattress. She was asleep, but it was a light, vigilant doze. Even in her dreams, she was listening for the rhythm of his breathing. 3 days. He had been unconscious for 3 days. Madame Pomfrey had assured her that it was normal. Magical exhaustion of that magnitude required a deep, coma-like state for the core to regenerate. "He is not in danger, Miss Granger," the matron had clucked, shooing Hermione away from his bedside for the 10th time. "He is merely recharging. Unlike some people, he knows when to rest." Hermione hadn't left. She had graded papers, she had stared out the window, and she had held his hand until her own fingers cramped. She shifted, a crick in her neck protesting the awkward angle. As she moved, the subtle, hummed connection in the back of her mind, the bond, rippled. It wasn't the roaring torrent it had been in the chamber. It was a quiet, steady thrum, like the purring of a cat or the idle engine of a very expensive car. Awake. The signal hit her mind before she even opened her eyes. It was a sensation of consciousness, a shift from the static of sleep to the sharp clarity of awareness. Hermione sat up abruptly, blinking against the light. Draco was watching her. He was propped up slightly against the pillows, looking pale and impossibly sharp against the sterile white of the hospital linens. His hair was loose, falling over his forehead in a way that made him look younger, softer. But his eyes, those storm-grey eyes, were alert, studying her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You're drooling, Granger," he rasped. His voice was rough, unused, stripped of its usual velvet polish. Hermione hastily wiped her mouth, feeling the heat rush to her cheeks. "I am not, and you're supposed to be comatose." "I got bored," he murmured. A faint smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth, a ghost of his old arrogance, but without the bite. "And you were snoring. It was very distracting." "I don't snore," she defended automatically, though her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm of relief against her ribs. He was awake. He was snarky. He was Draco. "You do," he countered softly. "It's surprisingly tolerable." He moved his hand on the coverlet, inching it toward hers. Hermione didn't hesitate. She covered his hand with her own, lacing their fingers together. The contact sent a warm, familiar wave of comfort through the bond, settling the anxious tremors in her stomach. "How do you feel?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Like I went 10 rounds with a Hungarian horntail and lost," he admitted, squeezing her fingers weakly. He looked down at their joined hands, his expression sobering. "The Weaver." "Stabilized," Hermione confirmed. "The rift is sealed. McGonagall says the magical ambient levels in the castle have returned to normal, or as normal as Hogwarts ever gets." "And us?" The question hung in the sunlit air, heavy and fragile. Draco looked up, searching her face. The vulnerability was back, raw and terrified. He was waiting for her to pull away. He was waiting for the logic to kick in, for her to realize that the crisis was over. The adrenaline had faded. and she was holding hands with a former Death Eater in the middle of the school infirmary. "The bond didn't break, Draco," Hermione said gently. "I can still feel you. You're anxious and thirsty, and you're wondering if I'm going to leave now that the heroics are done." Draco flinched slightly at the accuracy of the reading. He looked away, staring at the dust motes. "The crisis is over, Hermione. The artifact doesn't need us anymore. You don't have to stay anchored to a sinking ship just because you saved it once." "Is that what you think you are?" Hermione asked, leaning forward. "A sinking ship?" "I'm complicated," he said, his jaw tightening. "I'm baggage. I'm the man who made your life hell for 6 years. A few days of magical forced proximity doesn't erase history." "No," Hermione agreed. "It doesn't." She stood up, ignoring his flinch, and sat down on the edge of the bed. The mattress dipped under her weight. She reached out, cupping his face with her free hand, forcing him to look at her. "History matters," she said firmly. "But so does the present. And in the present, you are the man who tried to sacrifice himself to save me. You are the man who held on when I asked him to. And you are the man whose magic feels like home to me." Draco stared at her, his eyes widening. "Home," he whispered, the words sounding like a prayer he didn't believe in. "It's annoying, actually," Hermione teased gently, her thumbs stroking his cheekbone. "It's messy and chaotic and brooding, but yes, it feels like home." "Granger," he choked out. He leaned into her touch, his eyes fluttering shut. "You have terrible taste." "I know," she smiled, leaning down to press a soft kiss to his forehead. "I'm dating you, aren't I?" Draco's eyes snapped open. "Dating? Is that what this is? I thought we were just colleagues with a severe case of magical codependency." "We can be that too, if you prefer," she laughed. "But I think dating is easier to explain to the Daily Prophet." Draco let out a laugh, a real, genuine sound that seemed to surprise even him. He pulled her hand up to his lips, kissing her knuckles one by one. "Hermione," he said, his voice serious again. "I'm not going to make this easy. I'm difficult, I'm possessive, and I have a lot of dark corners." "I have a wand," she replied simply, "and I'm excellent at Lumos." He looked at her with such profound, unguarded adoration that Hermione felt like she was the one glowing. He pulled her down, and she went willingly, curling up carefully beside him on the narrow hospital bed. He wrapped his arm around her, burying his face in her hair. "Stay," he murmured. "Always," she promised. They lay there in the quiet warmth, letting the bond settle between them, no longer a lifeline in a storm, but a steady foundation for whatever came next. The peace, of course, lasted exactly 20 minutes. The double doors of the hospital wing banged open, and Headmistress McGonagall swept in, looking brisk and entirely too pleased with herself. She was followed by a floating tea service and a scroll of parchment that looked suspiciously like an official decree. "Mr. Malfoy," she greeted, marching to the foot of the bed. "I see you decided to rejoin the living. Excellent timing." Hermione scrambled to sit up, smoothing her robes, her face burning. Draco, to his credit, didn't move an inch. He kept his arm around Hermione's waist, looking at the headmistress with a look of bored entitlement. "Minerva," he drawled. "To what do we owe the pleasure? I was under the impression I was on medical leave." "You were," McGonagall said, the corner of her mouth twitching. "However, The Board of Governors has reviewed the data from the incident in the chamber. Hermione stiffened. Are we in trouble? On the contrary, McGonagall said, unrolling the parchment. The Ministry is fascinated. They believe the synaptic resonance you two achieved is a breakthrough in cooperative magic. They want to study it. Absolutely not, Draco said instantly. I am not a lab rat. Which is what I told them, McGonagall agreed smoothly. However, I did offer a compromise. Since you two have demonstrated such spectacular compatibility, and since the position is currently vacant, she paused for dramatic effect. I have appointed you both as the joint heads of the newly reinstated dueling club, she announced. And naturally, you will be leading the new elective course for NEWT students, Collaborative Magical Theory. Hermione blinked. Collaborative Magical Theory? That's not a real subject. It is now, McGonagall said, her eyes twinkling. The students are quite eager. Rumour has it the betting pool on when you two would stop hexing each other and start collaborating has made several Hufflepuffs very wealthy. Draco groaned, covering his eyes with his arm. They were betting on us? Everyone was betting on you, Draco, McGonagall said dryly. Even the portraits. Now rest up. Classes start on Monday. I expect a syllabus on my desk by Friday. She turned to leave, but paused at the door. She looked back at them, Draco lying in the bed, Hermione sitting beside him, their hands still firmly clasped. And 5 points to Slytherin, she added softly, for finally learning that some battles are better fought together. The doors swung shut. Draco lowered his arm, looking at Hermione with a mixture of horror and amusement. Collaborative magical theory, he repeated. She made that up. She definitely made that up just to force us to work together. It sounds fascinating, Hermione said, her mind already racing with curriculum ideas. We could cover dual casting, resonance shielding, maybe even rudimentary telepathic coordination. Granger, Draco interrupted, tugging on her hand. What? If we're going to teach this class, he said, a wicked glint entering his eyes, I insist on being the one to demonstrate the practical applications. Practical applications? Hermione raised an eyebrow. You know, he smirked, sitting up and leaning close to her ear. The non-verbal intimacy, the tension. The part where the magic gets heated. Hermione laughed, shoving his shoulder playfully, though she didn't pull away. You are incorrigible. We are going to be professional. We are going to be academic icons. We are going to be a disaster, Draco corrected, kissing her cheek. But we'll be a spectacular disaster. Hermione looked at him, really looked at him. The shadows were still there, deep in his eyes, and the scars were still on his soul. But he was smiling, and the bond between them was singing a song of promise. I can live with spectacular, she whispered. Draco leaned in, his lips brushing hers, soft and lingering. Good, he murmured against her mouth. Because I have a feeling, Professor Granger, that this is going to be a very long, very interesting project. Outside, the sun finally dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of violet and gold, the colours of their magic. In the castle, the torches flared to life. And in the quiet of the hospital wing, two former enemies sat together in the twilight, arguing softly about the syllabus, holding hands and beginning the long, beautiful work of weaving a life together. The end.
Thank you for listening to this story with me. I really love writing about Draco and Hermione. They're so different. One is like the sun, and other is like the night. But this story shows us that they need each other. I think we all want a love like this. A love that sees our dark parts but stay anyway. Draco was broken and Hermione was tired, but together they found balance. I wanted to show that even enemies can become soulmates. Sometimes the person you fight with is the only one who truly understands you. I hope this story made you feel hurt, feel warm, and I hope it made you believe in magic just a little bit more today. Thank you for your time. See you in the next story.